Good afternoon. Thank you again for being here today. I hope everyone had a lovely brunch. I don't have a very formal introduction for our presenter this afternoon. He made me promise not to tell you how many years he's been working at the college. But Dr. David Contasta has generously offered his time this afternoon to do this special presentation for your classes. And I hope and know that it's going to be a wonderful presentation. Dr. Contasta.
The answer to the question as to how long I've been here almost as long as you. I came just 3 years after some of you graduated, so I just missed all of you, and I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. I'm not going to harangue you without giving you a chance to say something. I'm going to break at one point, and it'll be obvious why I should, so that you can recall some of the things that Dr. Lukas used to say and do. We all know that he was a character, among other things. So I'm going to break, and you'll know when I'm going to break. I'll announce it, but it'll become obvious. I met John Lukas in February of 1974 when I came to the college for an interview. John had just turned 50 years old at that point, having been born on January 30th of 1924, same year the college was founded. As you know, John liked to talk about coincidences of dates. Do you remember that? He constantly talked about these kinds of coincidences. He was born in Budapest, Hungary, and in fact, the talk I'm giving today, I was supposed to give in Budapest because they were going to have a memorial conference about John on the anniversary of his death, and COVID hit, and they couldn't have it. But we did do it over Zoom instead, in honor of his 97th birthday. Would have been his 97th birthday this year. And they did record it, and they were going to do translations, and an odd thing happened. They recorded it, but when it came out, the English was in subtitles, and they had me speaking Hungarian. So John would like that a lot, I think. John came to the college in 1947 as a refugee from both Nazism and communism, and if you want to know more about his background, you should read his fascinating autobiographical work called Confessions of an Original Sinner, all right? Confessions of an Original Sinner, and he tells you what he means by that. There's a chapter in there about his teaching at the college. Has anyone read it? Yeah, very good. It's fascinating. All of you should read it. Required reading here. And then John retired in 1994 after 47 years at the college. He was the author of 35 books, many of them translated into other languages, including Japanese. He wrote extensively about World War II. Among these were the last European war and the duel, which was the 80-day struggle between Hitler and Churchill. And John was a great admirer of Winston Churchill, whom he thought had saved Western civilization. And one of John's prized possession was a bundle of cigars that had belonged to Winston Churchill. Churchill's grandson gave them to John because of the book that he had written, and it was in a special glass case in his library. And of course, John was an inveterate cigar smoker, as you probably know, so the cigars were doubly important to him. He didn't smoke them, they were old and dried up and so forth, and of course he wasn't going to do that. John died at home peacefully on May 6th, 2019, and his funeral was attended by the Hungarian ambassador to the United States, who came up from Washington, D.C., and there were obituaries in newspapers all over the world and in various languages. I knew of John Lukas 10 years before I came here for that interview because one of my history professors assigned us to read John's History of the Cold War, which was the first really decent history of the Cold War that anybody had done. And one of the reasons I was excited to apply for this job is that I'd be able to meet John Lucas, whether I got the job or not. I admired him so much. John explained after I met him that he had written this book, History of the Cold War, over about a dozen weekends, helped along by several boxes of large, expensive cigars. I guess that kept him going in the writing. And I'll say a little bit more about his history of the Cold War and the place that it holds in his thinking. I knew John over the next 45 years. In fact, I inherited his office, not the one that you know, but a later office. And so when I go into the office, I can feel John's presence, in fact. And while we were both here, he became the godfather of my younger son, who's also named John, for obvious reasons. The year I came to the college and met John, it was the 50th anniversary of the institution, and now we're up on the 100th, which is kind of scary when you think of how fast those years have gone. And John wrote a little history, a 50-year history of the college, which some of you may have seen. It's a rather thin volume. I want to read a couple of lines from that because I think those lines show what a wonderful writer John was, keeping in mind that English was his second language. And he published all these 35 books in English, and I said many of them were, of course, translated into other language. I think he had a fairly good working knowledge of French and German and Spanish and God knows what other languages besides. So let me quote just 2 paragraphs from his 50-year history of Chestnut Hill. The forest outskirts of the placid, often solemnant city of Philadelphia. This is where 15 homesick girls suddenly found themselves separated from the rest of the world on a beautiful September evening. I think many of us can relate to that. Maybe you all felt that way. And then he goes on to say, at night, an added row of windows shone about the darkening silhouette of the rows and clumps of trees. Let me read that again. I think this is just really beautiful and moving. At night, an added row of windows shone about the darkening silhouette of the rows and clumps of trees. And I think we can all imagine that occurring. And I'll get back to these lines, maybe not per se, but I'll get back to what he wrote as a way of explaining his view of history, which was rather idiosyncratic, as I think many of you know. Just a word now about John as a teacher, and this is where you come in to talk, as a teacher and a colleague. Students have long remembered that Dr. Lucas frequently made outlandish remarks in class to shock them into questioning some received verity or to help him to get across some point. But he did the same thing to the faculty. In the faculty lounge, he would often throw out verbal bombs to get us all arguing about something, and he didn't necessarily believe what he was saying, but he liked to experience the reactions. So I think this is a time when maybe some of you would like to recall John in the classroom. I'm calling him John, not Dr. Lucas, because that's how I knew him. Anybody have any reminiscences? Yes?
I'm a class of 61, and Dr. Lucas was my nature professor. At that point in time, we had to do, if you were in this special 2-year study program, which I was, you had to do a thesis. And he was the professor that got me the thesis. And I would go to his home in Phoenixville. I can still see his first wife, Irene, and his son at that time playing on the floor while he would guide me, and review what I was doing. In 2019, I went on a cruise with my daughter. She was doing it as part of her the whole focus was on the Normandy invasion. And David Eisenhower was the premier speaker. But there was a gentleman by the name of Alan Packwood, who was, at that time, I believe, the librarian at Churchill College. And he was also one of the speakers. And I was lucky enough to be able to have dinner with him. And he asked me, where I went to school, and I said, Chestnut Hill College. And he said, did you know John Lucas? I said, oh, he was my major professor, and, I was in touch with him briefly over the years, but not recently. And he went on about how wonderful John Lucas was, and how brilliant, and the fact that all the archives, the Churchillian archives, were first made available to him. And he then, the next morning at his lecture, he spent a good 15 minutes talking about John Lucas and how important his work was to the understanding of Churchill. And it was just so moving. It was so moving. And then, of course, to my brother's great embarrassment, he said, and we had an audience. He was one of his students. And of course, so Dr. Lucas is like a god. He's just wonderful. He's really influenced my life in so many ways.
Whenever I went to meetings, historical conferences around the country, and people would say, I'm from Chestnut Hill College, they'd say, oh, that's John Lucas's college, and how is he, and what is he doing? And it really made me feel as if I'm teaching at a very important place. Other comments or questions? Yeah, we must have some other comments. Yes?
Just a recollection, not of him, although he was my major professor as well, but when I was working at the college, and she pointed about him liking to, I would say, inspire conversation. There was a faculty meeting where the discussion was whether to, how to introduce business majors. How to, and you would know at the time. And there was a discussion about having marketing as a major, and he stood up and being recognized and said, marketing is what my wife does for choosing.
And I would add that faculty meetings could be wild in those days. They served wine at the faculty meetings. And in fact, before that, at the first faculty meeting, they would have open bar. And not only would John get up and rip into the administration, but several others of his generation would do the same thing. And many of them were of the World War II generation, and they weren't going to put up with guff from anybody, which I found kind of interesting. Any other comments? There must be some others. Yes?
I was a chemistry major, so history was not mine. But anyway, I had a paper that was due, and at the time I was trying to get it up on the dean's list, and so I wrote the paper and handed it. He gave me the I went out to him and I said, because I think it's good tonight. And I said, you're keeping it off the dean's list. So he said, no. What I do is I stand at the top of the steps and I take all the papers and the one that gets to the bottom first gets the A.
Of course. Yes.
Yes, I'm Betsy Flynn Hollow, class of 1970, English major. But my senior year, I was looking for electives because I didn't know all my requirements, and I was able to get into this Russian history class. And our primary book was Robert Massey's book, Nicholas and Alexander. And to this day, if you read that book, you don't need to read, with all due respect, another book about Russian history. And Dr. Lucas really emphasized the culture of the East and West, dynamics thinking of Russian history. Okay, so, and I actually received a leave from Dr. Lucas. offering it to classmates. And next to us, having lunch, was Dr. Myers, Joanne Myers, one of my favorites, and Dr. Lucas. So I went over to them and I said, would you like to taste some cheese? You know, I think I'm very foolish. I mean, shopping at the cheese shop. So, you know, they accepted it and they tasted it, and Dr. Lucas says, oh, this is cow cheese. And I'm thinking, what other kind And I said, what other kind is there? And he said, goat. And I said, all 5'5" of myself, said, you know what, Dr. Lucas, you intimidate. And Dr. Myers said, see, I told you. And he looked at me and he said, why? You're just as smart as I am.
Maybe one more if anybody has any. I'll tell you Joanna Myers and John Lucas' story. When Joanna came here, John had been here for a while, and he said, oh, it's nice to have another European here. And Joanna said, I beg your pardon? I am not European. Because a lot of the Brits don't think they're European, particularly now, of course. So that was an interesting story. All right, I'll plow ahead. Some of you may remember that John was a very good amateur pianist. And he loved to entertain us, faculty and student body, by playing and singing Cole Porter tunes. He particularly liked You're the Top, and I won't sing it because I don't have a particularly good singing voice, but I can see him out here in the rotunda playing the piano and singing, which was just another very interesting side of him. Very early during my years here, John and I discovered that we had some common interests. I was very interested in critics of the modern world, and in fact, I had published some articles about people like John Ruskin, Charles Péguy, and Henry Adams. And in fact, John encouraged me to write what was my first book, Henry Adams and the American Experiment, and it's going to be reprinted later on this year with a new introduction. John, in fact, talked to me about writing, saying that you can write and teach, and your writing and research will inform your teaching. It's not one or the other. So I'm very grateful for that piece of advice. As I think someone mentioned, John lived just beyond Valley Forge Memorial Park in Phoenixville. He had a Phoenixville address, and in fact, every morning when he came to the college, he drove through Valley Forge Park, smoking one of his cigars, of course. And when I first met him, he was living in an old converted schoolhouse. Is that the one that you remember? And he had added an octagonal library onto that. And it had one of these ladders so that you could climb up to the second story of it. The land on which the old schoolhouse stood had been in his wife's family for 2 centuries. And he later built on that land a modest but comfortable house with cream-colored stucco walls on the outside. And you could imagine it was a country house, a small country house in Eastern Europe. It had that flavor about it. And he built another library, not octagonal, but it was rectangular, and he eventually accumulated some 20,000 books in that library. And I understand that he died in that library, surrounded by all of these books. The house overlooked a small reservoir, a little lake. And I want to quote what John wrote about his feelings towards that property in a book he published called The End of the 20th Century. It's really moving, and it tells us a lot about his philosophy of history, not unlike what he wrote concerning that first day here at Chestnut Hill College in 1924. He writes, "Sometimes after dinner, I walk to the grassy slope beyond our terrace, In those moments, the charm of the present is inseparable from a satisfying sense of the past. Because it is good to know that everything I now see is still the same landscape that the American ancestors of my children saw 50, 100, 150, and 200 years ago. It's this sense of rootedness that John talked about again and again that caused him to call himself a reactionary. Now, a lot of people said he was a conservative, but John rejected that and said that he was a reactionary. Of course, technically, a reactionary is somebody who wants to go back to a golden age in the past, and that's not what John meant by it. He was hard to pin down ideologically. He was his own person. He had his own ideas. And in his memoirs, he complains that, and I quote, conservative is a very malleable word, or a very slippery word. In his book, The End of the 20th Century, he complains, our conservatives in the United States care not for the conservation of the country and of the American land. Our conservatives care not for the conservation of the country and of the American land. And so again and again, he calls himself a reactionary. Now, what he's saying here is that often conservatives are all in favor of business doing whatever it wants, gouging all the natural resources out of the earth that they want, doing anything for a buck and not giving a damn about the environment or about conserving the land. And that's the kind of conservatism that he did not like, and that's the kind of conservatives that he did not like. It's not that John didn't believe in progress, but because he believed in human nature, he thought that only so much change was possible. And again, he reminds us that we're all prone to be sinners, which is one of the reasons for the title of his book, The Confessions of Original Sinner. He also goes on to say many times in many places that the past is all we can know. We don't know the future. We really don't know where we are now, although he would say that the past informs the present. That's the only way we can know how we got to where we are. So there's this rootedness that gives us meaning to our lives. And I think because John was uprooted and because he was a refugee, it was very important for him to be able to go out after dinner and to stand there on that landscape and know that his wife's ancestors had seen the same landscape 50, 100, 150, and 200 years ago. So it's this rootedness that's very important to him, and that's why he calls himself a reactionary too. Because of his views of human nature, he's also an anti-anti. Now, by that he means he's an anti-communist. You're smiling. Do you remember his saying that and talking about that? No, he's an anti-anti. Okay. Anybody guess what he means by this, that he's an anti-anti? And I think this comes out in his history of the Cold War. Okay. He thought that the anti-communists in this country were going crazy with people like Joe McCarthy and others who were accusing people who were innocent of being communists. And because of his belief in human nature, and I think as somebody mentioned here, he thought the Cold War, that is this contention between the United States and the Soviet Union, was really more rooted in geostrategic concerns and the Soviets' concerns about being attacked again and again and again from the West. That was at the root of the Cold War more than communism, in fact. And he also believed that communism wouldn't last because it's contrary to human nature. And he said eventually the Soviets are going to leave Eastern Europe and Hungary is going to be free. And so are all those other satellite countries. And he was right on. That's exactly what happened. And he thought that stirring up a lot of trouble, screaming around about the Soviets and so forth, did us no good. Which led him to a correspondence and then a friendship with George Kennan. Who can tell us who George Kennan is? I'll play teacher here. Yes. right? And what did he write? What was his famous? Yeah. No, it was called the Long Telegram. Truman wanted him to report on what was going on in the Soviet Union, how they viewed the West, and it was called Long Telegram because it was a long telegram. It was 800 words long, I think. Anyway, Kennan came up with the doctrine of containment. It was 8,000 words, excuse me. The doctrine of containment. But he only wanted it to be extended to the Soviet Union, not to the whole world. And he was very critical when we applied the doctrine of containment to Vietnam, let's say, and really to every place in the world. He became very critical of American foreign policy. And John came out very much against the Cold War. In fact, John wrote a book about Kennan called George Kennan, A Study in Character. Kennan lived to be, I think, 100 or maybe even a little over. And John went to visit him and his wife many, many times. I could say a lot more about John's being a reactionary, but one part of it was his belief in patriotism, but not in nationalism. And John said that nationalism is an aggressive, egotistical, dangerous attitude of thinking that you're right and everybody else is wrong, that you have the best country in the world, and that everybody else should go along with your way of life. Patriotism, on the other hand, is love of country, actually the love of fatherland. So John says, I'm a patriot, but I'm not a supranationalist, and nationalism can be very dangerous. A part of his reactionary view, too, is his love of bourgeois values. Do you remember his talking about that? Yeah, his bourgeois values. What did he mean by those? Do you recall? You're smiling there. Long time ago, okay. Probably. No, but he actually liked bourgeois values, interestingly enough. And to him, they were solid family comforts, a nice house, good manners, dependability, civil discourse, although he wasn't always civil in the faculty lounge, as I suggested to you, and love of books. And there was this dislike of conservative icons like Ronald Reagan. Now, you'd think that he would love Ronald Reagan, but he didn't. And he didn't because he saw Reagan as the kind of person who's going to unleash business, unleash the economy, let people do whatever they want with the land. It's not the kind of conservative he believed in. He didn't believe in libertarianism, certainly. And it's interesting that he has often voted for Democrats as he did Republicans. And that's not what I would call a conservative. So he is sui generis. He's John Lucas. He votes for Democrats, he votes for Republicans, whoever he wants to vote for. I think that coming out of an Eastern European background, the dual monarchy hadn't been disbanded all that long before he was born in Hungary. He had that remnant of a strong sense of central government in these European countries. Timothy Snyder, who wrote a book called On Tyranny, gave a talk here at the college last year, and he praised John Lucas to the skies. Again, he said, I'm speaking in John Lucas's college, and he quotes John Lucas. So I think this is another example of the reach that John had. I'll conclude by saying that I owe John Lucas a great deal. As I said earlier, he encouraged me to write and to publish, as well as to teach and to inform my teaching through my writing. I discussed with him my ideas about books and how to frame them. I remember walking with him not long after I had come here and talking about this book that became Henry Adams and the American Experiment. And we walked along this road down here. The trees were really little because that wasn't that much longer after the moving of the creek over and so forth. And we had a long discussion about this book and how I was going to handle it. That comes out very distinctly to me. And then I mentioned how people at historical conferences came up to me because I was from Chestnut Hill College, from John Lucas's college. Maybe it should have been called the Lucas College, I don't know. So I'm honored and proud that I knew John Lucas, and I think that we should all be honored and proud that he graced our halls and our classrooms for nearly 50 years. John represented the excellence of our college to the outside world time and time again. So Godspeed, John Lucas. If anyone has any questions or comments? Yes.
I do have a question, and I wonder, since you knew him personally and as a colleague, how did he happen to be hired at Chestnut College? Do you have any?
I think he maybe got it through Kunhelt Ladin, I think, right? Is that correct? A man named Kunhelt Ladin, who was also a refugee, and he knew John. Actually, John came in 1946 to Columbia University, I believe, and then he came down here. He was only 23 years old when he came here and began teaching here. And I think the Sisters of St. Joseph almost saw him as a son. They really were protective of him when he came here. Okay, all right, that makes sense, yes. Yes, anybody else?
I heard, he said once, and it must have been in an interview, this has to be years later, that he would never leave the Sisters of St. Joseph, that he was so grateful to them that this is where he belonged.
Yeah, the comment was that John was very grateful to the Sisters of St. Joseph, and I think that's true. He would very quietly sometimes finance a trip for a sister or pay for a need of a sister. Wouldn't say anything about it to anybody. So he was very generous in that respect. Yes?
Why were the criminals credentials out of Hungary when they came here, but the sisters that were in approve all this work?
I believe that. People weren't as careful about things, I guess.
But also, he had told us that his mother and grandmother got, they insisted that he leave, even though he had to leave them behind in Hungary, and made sure that he went to England so that he could get his doctoral studies completed there. Because he wouldn't have the credentials in Hungary, but he would have the, that's what he had told us. Nancy, you're shaking your head. Oh, yeah, and then years later, when I was working here, Dr. Ladin came back for a visit, and he was here, and they were reminiscing about how Dr. Ladin knew his reputation for valedictorian, introduced him to Sister Catherine Francis, and just as with some of you may remember Father Palmer. Yes. So was a refugee from, World War II and all that, and it sort of took him in, and in Father Palmer's case, gave him a place to live, and set them all here with teaching at the college, and we're happy to have.
Well, John explained, I think he does this in the Confessions of an Original Sinner, that people in Hungary were either Germanophiles or Anglophiles, and his parents were Anglophiles, and so he went to a private school, or actually they called it a public school in England, and he was supposed to go back in 1939 to go to Cambridge. And of course, the war broke out, and he was not able to go back, but he spoke English very well. And if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure, he took himself to Vienna at the end of the war and offered to be a translator for the U.S. Army to, I think, interview German war criminals. He was very fluent in German also. And I think because of that, he was able to get a visa, if I'm correct about that, to come to the United States. He was also drafted into the Hungarian army, and the Hungarian army was fighting on the side of the Germans. And so he deserted and was thrown into a camp. And his father had some connections and was able to get him out. So he had a very harrowing youth, and so coming to a beautiful place like Chestnut Hill must have been a godsend for him. Yes, Rita.
I think that part of his affection for the Sisters of St. Joseph happened on the day that he came to interview for a position. Sister Maria Kotz-Balute interviewed him, and they spent a couple of hours together. And at the end of well, I see we've missed your dinner hour. You must have dinner here. And she had dinner served to him. And he said, I was a funny-looking guy that had come up on a bicycle. And he said, she took me in, and he said, and that did it. And he said he had that affection that stayed with him the whole time. The other thing I'd like to mention is his sense of humor. He tells the story of being with his second wife, Stephanie, that they went into a restaurant at one point, and she said, oh, John, look at that woman. She must have been very beautiful when she was young. And he said, well, we'll never be able to say that about you. John, and he said, there would be no need to use the past conditional tense. And then the other thing, and she said if he voted for Nixon, she would serve him canned peas the rest of his life. She had a great sense of humor.
John's first wife died, as you know, and Anne Marie was a baby at that point, and he brought her here, and the sisters looked after her while he was teaching. Yes.
I think that's my most poignant memory of John Lucas, is we were all in his classrooms one time, and he climbed the steps and rang bells so the whole town would know. And he began to post that stuff, never forgotten it. And the young lady that he had,
And do you remember we all went to the
and then we went.
She was sick, and he invited all the senior history majors over, and we brought food.
Can you stand up so we can hear you?
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
No,
No, just following on Nancy's comment, in class of 71, we were seniors when his wife was dying, and he asked all the majors to come to the house one Sunday afternoon in Phoenixville to cheer her up. And we went in little groups, there were 17 history majors in our class. And we went little groups of 1 and 2 up to the bedroom. It was just a very, what was the name of that man who wrote the George Russ? It was a columnist for the Evening Bulletin. And he was there, was a good friend of John's, lived in Chestnut Hill, and he opened the door for us. It was a very touching day. And what was the Holy Chair? Yes, that's right. He said, oh, the Holy Chair, John, they're here. Yes, and but it just was fascinating that he thought our visit would brighten her day, and of course we weren't going to say no, so we all trooped out there in our Sunday best.
and I think it humanized John Lucas, who I was intimidated.
Yes.
I love him, yes, I was totally intimidated by him, but the love that he professed in front of all of us, his wife, you were, wow.
Yeah. I remember his son used to come to class.
Yes.
Paul walked down, he was a student at Norwood Bonbon. And he was, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, and would walk down Germantown and then just sit in the back of the classroom.
And Paul's now in his 60s, so. Yes.
A question, you said the Hungarians were either Anglophiles or?
Germanophiles. That is, they either sided with Germany or spoke German and lapped up German culture, because that made sense because of the dual monarchy, or they were Anglophiles, and his parents were Anglophiles.
His barbs or his moms. I do remember, and I try to remember, I don't think my class was early morning. Maybe it was after, I think it was after lunch. And every once in a while, and of course, remember, I'm intimidated.
So was I at first.
Throw out this comment, and I remember thinking, what is crazy? And then finally, once he'd say, he'd slap the desk, and he'd go, are you all awake?
He could be a wild man, too. I remember being in his house, and he would toast and then throw the glasses into the fireplace as if he were Zorba the Greek or something like that. So, anything else? I don't know whether they do or not. You could go down and see. Many of them are still in print. Many of them are still in print. I know that. And you can go on Amazon and find his name and then a number of books that are under his name.
Your comment about the being of cats also, sorry, Tom, I remember him playing for us on different occasions at his house. And one time, we had, again, when I was working in Vermont as a student, we had received a grant to teach high school teachers. And what sold the grant, this was from a national government foundation, what sold it was that the two people who were going to be actually teaching these teachers, John Lucas and Lester Connor. For those of you who remember him. And Lester was sort of the point person, and he organized, and they were here, living here, residing on campus for 2 weeks, and we had to provide their entertainment as well as the education. And one of them was, one night was to take them to John Lucas's house out in Gainesville. And he said to me when we all got there, I'm going to play the piano for you. And I said, that's wonderful, you know what they want. And he started, as you said, doing some Gershwin and
Yeah, he liked this.
And then he said to me, do you think they know Satie? And I said, I don't know if they do. And he said, well, let's see how knowledgeable they are. And he started, and not one of them. And I remember cringing, because then he said, she was my student. She knows Satie. Like, I just wanted the ear to open up. And he then proceeded to give a lecture on Eric Satie.
Oh, yeah.
They tended.
He was really a Renaissance man. Okay, thank you very much.